So I received a challenge or a request from a longtime viewer and supporter of the channel, Theo. Theo comes up in conversation a fair bit because he knows the history of the videos I've made in the past so well. I sometimes can't remember where I said something, and I ask Theo, didn't I once make a video talking about this or that political issue? Do you remember where that happened? And more often than not, he does. His memory of my back catalog of videos tends to be better than mine. And Theo has said to me that I never made a video really directly speaking to anarchism. And in my case, that will be inevitably speaking against anarchism. As he knows, I'm not an anarchist. I don't identify with anarchism positively in any way. So let's really briefly expand on that before I get on with the video. Anarchism is partly a critique of the status quo. It's partly just a description of the status quo, an analytical description of the status quo in certain circumstances. And then it's partly an aspiration for a future system of political organization, a type of future society. I won't say utopia. That might be a little bit insulting to their political tendency. You can certainly see videos right now on YouTube of anarchists explaining to you exactly what type of social organizations they want to have in future, et cetera, where it's that third category that they're dreaming about. I think that most people get drawn into anarchism through category one. They see in the writings of anarchist authors a critique of the current political establishment, and that critique may be fruitful for them or it may be insightful. They may feel that they identify things that are wrong with the situation now. The footnote here is identifying something that's wrong with our system of organization is very different from having a better system on offer to replace it with. I can tell you a whole list of things that are wrong with the stock market. Then you ask, okay, well, do you actually have a better way to organize capital and investment that's going to accomplish this, that, and the other? And I may not. However, on a more modest level, of course, it's very possible to just identify problems and then ameliorate those specific problems. You may just find a form of corruption in the stock market, and you can say, well, look, I'm not trying to replace the stock market or abolish the stock market. I just want to address these problems. It's a different kind of analysis. Obviously, when we're talking about anarchism, most of these things are not in that ameliorative category of calling for modest social reforms. The sense in which anarchism is important as a description of the here and now, category 2 there, is also worth commenting on a little bit. I remember once I was talking to another scholar of history of Asia. I think his PhD was in literature of Asia, actually. And I referred to a certain period in the history of Buddhism as being anarchic. And this was talking about Buddhism exiting northern India and entering western China. So you're talking about a part of the world that now has been completely transformed by Islam. You're talking about like Afghanistan, Pakistan, Uzbekistan, and westernmost parts of China. Part of the world where, most of it today, Buddhism has been wiped out by Islam, is the Islamic empires centuries later exterminating indigenous religion, converting people with the sword, and so on. But anyway, so I use the word anarchic to describe the social, political, and religious situation into which Buddhist ideas first penetrated, seeping out of northern India. And again, India has changed shape because Islam conquered northern India. But anyway, so India used to go a lot further north, culturally and politically. So radiating up northeast out of India and then eventually getting into these kind of really weird wastelands of the western greater China area, areas that most of the historical records for China and almost all periods refer to as being full of barbarians. What was it? I remember reading an historical source that said, for this period of 5 centuries, the single most commonly used phrase in Chinese history is, barbarians attacked the western frontier. And he had the number, like in a period of 500 years, 3,000 times or something, that phrase is used. So, I was using the word anarchic. I was talking about anarchy in a very factually descriptive way. And I remember this guy with a PhD, he just sneered at me and laughed at me. I said, what do you mean? Like, in this sense, I'm not using it in a pejorative sense. It can be very important to talk descriptively about how human beings exist, what happens to society in real-world anarchic situations, where there is no government, where it really is about one man and his sword and his donkey, or however it is people are surviving. And I think it is important to talk about the ways in which Buddhism transformed uniquely in that anarchic setting, which took on transformations and new meanings and new iconography, which it never would have taken on, by contrast, in the very settled, hierarchical world of the Sri Lankan aristocracy, the transmission of Buddhism going south out of India through Sri Lanka, which also eventually reached China and Japan, by the way. So you get changes in the meanings of things change. So these two categories, the analytical, critical aspects of why people talk about anarchism, there's almost no contact between them and the more utopian project of looking to the future and proposing that anarchism has some value in this way. So a question might be posed, having disclosed these different categories. Would it be possible that someone sees value in anarchism, that someone thinks of anarchism positively in the short term as a process, while rejecting the long-term goal it's tending towards? So I'll give an example of what I mean here. Charity, in the short term, as a process to accomplish something within our lifetimes, charity is something in that sense I can endorse. However, when you look at charity in principle, when you look at charity over the long term, over centuries, it's actually something I'm opposed to. I know it sounds absurd. Stick with me for a minute, you'll see why. I'm morally opposed to living in a society where the generation that's alive today, the present generation at any given point of time, is beholden to the will of deceased millionaires from the past. So as centuries go by, if you have a general situation of legislative stability, you don't have a revolution that destroys everything, then you have a person like Bill Gates. Bill Gates is a multimillionaire, incredibly wealthy. Bill Gates creates a foundation, creates a charity with his huge amount of money, and then that charity pursues his ideals of education. It funds education in pursuit of his ideals. And before Bill Gates, there's a long series of millionaires who left similar funds, similar bequests, created similar foundations with their own philosophy of education. Now, obviously, until recently, most of those were very conservative Christian ideas of education. So in terms of the philosophy of education, what's happening now in the world of education policy, in fact, most of the money and most of the influence is tied to the will of deceased persons from the past, and in some cases, people like Bill Gates who are still alive today, but nevertheless, their ideas have been set in stone in well-funded institutions, and then that influence goes on forever. And there's no transparency and no public accountability, and nobody gets elected, nobody gets to question it. And what does Bill Gates know about education anyway? To give another example, a more traditional Christian example, there's a very influential educational foundation in linguistics and language study called SIL, the Summer Institute of Linguistics. And it was founded by what I would call insane Christian missionaries. If you call them normal Christian missionaries, okay. Where you draw the dotted line between normal and insane, it's up to you. But these are conservative Christian ideas. They're a major influential educational and language research institute. But obviously, when you look at that, both in principle and over the passage of centuries, you say, okay, there's something wrong with it. So someone could challenge me. I'm steel manning Theo's position here and say, well, look, even if you don't subscribe to this long-term, more utopian idea of where this is going to, and even if you don't agree with this in principle in this sense, can't you see some short-term benefit in anarchism here and now? In the same way that I can see a benefit in charity here and now. Like, hey, right now we can form a charity to accomplish some things for veganism or to help the homeless or help the poor, cope with earthquake, whatever the purpose might be. Where there's some clear benefit here and now that makes me overlook both what's wrong with this ideology in principle and in terms of its long-term implications. For me, it's very easy to answer no for anarchism. Within that framework, I see more value short-term in basically any other mainstream political ideology you can name. There's more that could be accomplished by joining the Conservative Party in 2019, within our lifetimes, pragmatically, than could possibly be accomplished by joining any of the anarchist factions that now exist. So this is so stepping away from matters of principle and into pragmatics. I think it's really important to note. I mean, the single most famous and celebrated left anarchist or left-wing anarchist during my lifetime was Noam Chomsky. Is there anyone in anarchist politics today who is more significant than Noam Chomsky? Is there anyone whose opinion matters as much as, hard to think of a good example here. I was going to say something like Bernie Sanders, but that's probably setting the bar far too high. Now, okay, put it in perspective this way. If you've been watching this channel for a long time, you've heard me criticize the ideology of libertarianism, pointing out that libertarians on the internet really feel that they're a major influential political ideology in the world, that they are a philosophy, that they're an approach to politics that needs to be taken seriously in any given political debate. And I've sometimes argued back, pointing out the relative historical triviality of libertarianism. Like, look, this isn't really a major influential political philosophy. But if on a scale of 1 to 10, if we rate libertarianism like a 3 out of 10, then left-wing anarchism is a 0. It has no significance at all. Why do I say this? Well, libertarianism, they've had millions of dollars in support, at least hundreds of thousands of dollars. They've had a lot of money given to them by the Koch brothers. The Koch brothers are multimillionaires who are so wealthy and influential that they've managed to convince the mainstream press in America to pronounce their name the Koch brothers. Whereas everyone else with the same last name, including Mayor Ed Koch, quite a few famous people have had that name, pronounce it Koch. But not in this case. They prefer the pronunciation Coke, and they pay a lot of money to make sure you pronounce their name the way that they want to. Well, the Koch brothers, they took libertarianism and kind of weaponized it into a political ideology, and they've pushed it forward in various contexts. And I think, for example, to come back to philosophy of education, if you're analyzing what's wrong with the American high school system and the American university system, so leaving aside early childhood education, there actually is a point in that debate or discussion where someone could say, fruitfully and pointedly, well, what about the libertarian approach to education reform, to philosophy of education? Libertarianism, for better and for worse, actually has been influential during the last 50 years in philosophy of education, institutional education reform. So if you don't know, one of the most influential ideas that libertarians have pushed for is the idea of a voucher system and giving parents freedom of choice, where parents are given a voucher by the government, say, okay, the government will pay for you to put your kids into a school, but now you get to choose which school you put your kids into. And then part of this is, it's normally linked to what's called a magnet school strategy. So you have one school that specializes in science and one that specializes in music, and they focus on different areas of excellence. And then there's actually some kind of meaningful selection made by the parents. This philosophy also emerged out of the unique problems of racial segregation in the United States. And from what I've read, it is an area of interest for me, but not a major area of interest. There are some successful case studies where this approach, vouchers, more freedom of choice for parents, and having schools specialize, not just to say we're the school for this neighborhood, but where they really pick different areas of excellence that they try to pursue, that it has had positive outcomes. So libertarianism, it can be taken seriously in that way. Again, on a scale of 1 to 10, libertarianism is not a 0, it's maybe a 3. They've been a voice in some of the major political debates in our time. Education is not even the most obvious or outstanding. Obviously, it's in economics they could discuss the most. Libertarianism actually did get debated at least around 2012, not so much in 2016, in reference to America's military policy, militarism. They've had a few different unique voices and so on. Where does anarchism rank in any of this? And Theo is specifically speaking to left-wing anarchism, what he calls left anarchism. This is a movement that's so marginal. I mean, I know, Theo, I know for you regard this as a major voice in 21st century politics, okay? but it's not. You're talking about a few dozen people on forums on the internet, and here on YouTube, fair enough. This is a very small, very minor, very powerless movement. Of course, if you want to argue that anarchists should have more to say, okay, that's kind of a separate argument. But I think you'd have to start by recognizing this is an incredibly marginal political movement. And it may matter to you emotionally. You may feel there are great authors, that there are people who've meant a lot to you in terms of the books you've read and so on. You may feel those have a lot to offer under those three categories, either as an analysis of what's wrong here and now, as a factual description of an analysis of the real world here and now, or, that third category, the more utopian, the idea of what society could be in the future. If you feel that way, that's fine. Nobody's going to take that feeling away from you. But I think you have to recognize that even compared to some popular works of science fiction, this has been very, very little influential in the 21st century, and there's no indication that it will be more influential. I don't think that the ideas of left-wing anarchism have played any role in the elections that just happened in Israel. I don't think they're having any role in the elections that are now unfolding in Canada. I don't think they will have any role in the upcoming elections in the United Kingdom, in England. It's presumed that quite soon England is going to have another set of elections. I won't get into the details here. And by contrast, something like libertarianism, you can actually talk about the libertarian ideas that came up in all of those. Libertarianism is a factor, even if it's not a major or influential factor. So again, on a scale of 1 to 10, you're talking about something that's very close to 0. So to come back to this idea of the third category, thinking about the future, thinking about the utopia, thinking about the objective you're working toward, utopian or not, maybe pragmatic. Theo said something quite interesting to me in this very short discussion, this short interchange we had back and forth. And that is that he said he really basically feels the end point, the goal he wants to work towards, or the goal for him politically, is a society such as Sweden, what Sweden already has today. So Sweden is a very interesting example. If you look up Sweden in the Freedom House listings, I believe, so I'll mention what Freedom House is in just a moment. I believe Sweden has a perfect score of 100 out of 100. So the Freedom House rankings rate civil liberties, democracy, freedom in that practical sense in different countries around the world. And they give a very high rating to Canada and the United States. They're above 90 out of 100. You can compare Sweden to Switzerland and so on. The Freedom House rankings, they're really calibrated to notice the small differences in oppression between North Korea and Cambodia and Thailand. That's normally where the attention is focused, is on countries that are either struggling to be democratic, or maybe they've been democratic and then they've had a coup d'etat that have gone through history that way. It's not really calibrated to evaluate the contrast between Sweden and Denmark. But nevertheless, as I recall, Sweden actually gets a perfect 100 out of 100 score. So there is a sense in which Sweden as it exists today is recognized even quantitatively, not just qualitatively, as an incredibly successful society. I think there were a lot of very interesting questions to ask for. Is that attainable for England? Could England catch up with Sweden? Is that attainable for Canada? Could Canada catch up with Sweden? And then really interesting questions. What about Taiwan? What about Singapore? What about China? Who really can achieve what Sweden has achieved? And maybe the answer is everybody. Maybe we can all live in a country at the same level of democracy and freedom in a practical sense that Sweden is in, at the same high quality of education that Sweden has achieved, the same liberty of the press to criticize the government, so on and so forth, the same kind of highly regulated economy, but it's nevertheless a free market, for-profit, free enterprise, if you like, capitalist economy, the hybrid society that Sweden has created. So if that's the destination, because that's what Theo has proposed, and it's strange to say, but most people have done even a little bit of research on Sweden. I know it's going to sound like a weird claim. I think actually most people around the world would agree that that's a desirable goal to move towards. Like, if you asked people in Japan, okay, do you want to move towards a Swedish model of government? Japan would be an interesting one to examine because they're also a very successful country. If you asked people in Canada, if you ask people in many different societies, it'd be interesting to know how people in England regard Sweden that way. I don't think they're going to look down on Sweden and say, no, that's a terrible model for a society. I think a very large percentage of people would actually recognize that what Sweden has accomplished in education, in policing, even in the quality of their prisons, under so many different headings that are related to democracy, some of them more integral to democracy, some of them more peripheral, they would say, wow, Sweden really is a model of excellence for us to aspire to. Okay, but if we accept Sweden as the end point you're working towards, which is debatable, but for the sake of this argument, say that. What then is the significance of anarchism short term as a vehicle for getting you from your current situation to a future that more closely resembles Sweden? That to me doesn't make sense. You know, in a sense, it's easier for me to appreciate the anarcho-primitivists. There are anarcho-primitivists say they want to destroy the current society and return to a kind of Bronze Age, rugged, survivalist, low technology anarchic society. Okay, so there the end point is completely different. So the significance of anarchism now, destructively and otherwise, okay, I got it. But if your idea of the future, or your ideal, is to catch up with Sweden, there are many different struggles, there are many different political causes we can describe between here and there, but it is not clear to me that anarchism would be in any way useful within our lifetimes. I don't think it would be useful as an analysis, as a description, nor as a utopian ideal, not as a movement in any sense. So for me, I have to kind of reject it all and utterly. I won't digress to say much more about this. I don't think Sweden is the ideal of a society I'd want to move towards. For me, there are many things that are strikingly wrong with Swedish society, but I think most people wouldn't agree with me. Just to give a really short rundown, Sweden to me is a nation of alcoholics. I'm really big on sobriety. I don't want to live in a society of heavy alcohol drinkers. And that's one aspect of Swedish culture. So really, don't underestimate number of liters of alcohol per year consumed by the Swedes. It's also, of course, a country built on meat and dairy, that kind of diet. It's also a country built on a very Christian culture. I know Swedes don't think that's true. They think they're very secular, but whatever. So for me, there are many aspects of Swedish society that leap out right now as being less than ideal. So it's not the goal I'd work towards. However, I do want to make a separate YouTube video talking about the Swedish education system and how it is that a small country, it's not particularly wealthy, ended up with one of the best university systems in the world. What were the decisions that were made? What was the kind of bureaucratic and democratic process that led to them having excellence in university education when so many other countries, including the United States and Canada, have a higher education system that is, frankly, terrible. Okay, so look, this video was made in response to a request from one person for me to speak directly on anarchism. The most positive thing I can say to you about anarchy and anarchism is that I understand that as a literary trope, many people find it fascinating and inspirational. Many people even read Henri David Thoreau. I don't know the correct way to pronounce him right. Everyone used to say Henry David Thoreau, but hey. People read books like that and they respond to the rugged individualism and the anti-authoritarian attitudes in these things. I once read a book by an American journalist, and it really talked about anarchism in terms of refusing to comply with state authority and state power, even in situations like the town hall is on fire. You're in a small city or something, and the city hall is on fire, and the government rounds people up and forces them to join a fire brigade, to move buckets of water to throw out the city hall. I remember reading this book, and it was written in a very inspirational way, and it really argued, no, if you don't have the right to refuse, if you can't refuse that and say, no, I'm not your soldier, I don't work for you, I don't have to pick up a bucket of water and put out the fire. That's up to me. He was really arguing, if you don't believe in that, then you believe in authoritarianism in principle and not anarchism. And his point was, I mean, again, this is kind of interesting to meditate on and reflect on. His point was, look, in the real world, from the perspective of the government, something's always on fire. Something's always burning. It may seem to the government like the Cuban Missile Crisis in the 1960s is the biggest crisis in the world and all kinds of terrible things have happened. And you know what? You look back later, or you think about, even if you were alive at the time, you have a little bit more of a detached, informed perspective. Like, come on, guys. These negotiations over missiles in Cuba, it's not that big a deal. Even the whole event of the Great Depression, when you go back and look at the statistics for the Great Depression in the United States, yeah, people made this out to be such a big crisis. In the history of economic crises, kind of average size. There's just a lot of political propaganda about it. What were people saying about it? His point was, it's always possible for the government to manufacture a crisis or to perceive something as a crisis, and if you don't get to use your own judgment. I remember reading that. I remember reading different texts that were inspired by anarchism in various ways. And you know what the most extreme and the most sympathetic were? I have also read the Japanese anarchists. And the Japanese anarchists are more inspiring because their work is derivative of Max Stirner. So Max Stirner is an egoist rather than an anarchist. There's this whole school of thought of Japanese anarchism. And there it's even more emotionally appealing because they're these anarchists who are standing up against the emperor. They're standing up against the unfolding tragedy of the Japanese empire that's kind of gradually transitioning from democracy to dictatorship. The timeline for that, it's not like Germany. It's not a simple situation where the Nazis take over and burn down the Reichstag or something. It's really not. There's this gradual transition. And the anarchists in Japan at that time are screaming, no, 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 don't you see, this is authoritarianism. They're trying to stand up against this seemingly irresistible authoritarian juggernaut that takes Buddhist values and Taoist values and all these traditional values and makes this very appealing package. It's appealing also because, of course, it's offering modern technology, westernization, modernization in Japan at that point was a big transition. Forcing everyone to wear European-style clothes rather than wearing traditional Japanese clothes. And people are seeing airplanes for the first time and stuff coming into their lives. This huge leap forward in technology wrapped up with traditionalist rhetoric and values. And the anarchists are the people in Japan at that time saying, no, no, no. And some of them were put on trial for plotting to assassinate the emperor. I've read the history of those trials. It's very moving. You can read their poetry. Some of those anarchists, they wrote poetry in Japanese. I read it in English, of course. And, you have this very appealing narrative in which ultimately the anarchists are victims and they're the canary in the coal mine crying out against, authoritarianism. In these kinds of contexts, sure, the history of anarchism has produced a body of literature that people find beguiling and entertaining and ideologically seductive. However, I have to tell you, I don't believe in it. That's all it boils down to. And whether I'm talking about sewage treatment or solar power or taxation or philosophy of education, whenever I'm talking about any real-world application, I see no seat at the table for the anarchists. There's no sense in which the anarchists could have or should have a seat at the table to discuss what this policy should be. I don't think they have anything to contribute to the discussion, apart from the fact that we're talking about left-wing anarchists. They're an incredibly weak movement. But even if they were invited to the table, I really just do not believe that they have anything to offer. What's the future of Afghanistan? I'm recording this video right now. This is September 19th of 2019. So the future of Afghanistan is incredibly unpredictable right now. Donald Trump had one plan and threw it in the garbage and tried another plan. It's totally unclear what the Americans are going to do. It's totally unclear what the Afghans themselves are going to do. It's totally unclear even what the Taliban are going to do. This is a moment when Afghanistan could go one way or another. What's the anarchist position on Afghanistan? If we're going to have that debate, let's just say, even on an academic level, You're going to invite 20 different speakers from 20 different perspectives. Maybe there is one seat at the table for libertarianism. I don't sympathize with the libertarian, but maybe the libertarians get a seat at the table. Maybe they really have something to say. There's a libertarian critique of the war in Afghanistan, and they have some positive suggestion for the future. I doubt it. But if you think about all the different political ideologies that are contending to have a seat, that are contending to have a voice, I see absolutely no legitimate voice at that table for anarchism. I don't see a legitimate voice at the table for talking about ecological policy right now, which is very top-down. It's all about, government policy and government coercion. It is, ultimately. I see no seat at the table for the anarchist perspective on reducing carbon emissions, especially the left-wing anarchist perspective. I don't see any seat at the table for them on healthcare policy, on the future of universities. And again, very fundamentally, if for Theo, for this one person, if for him the destination is catching up with Sweden, then how do we get there? My answer is not anarchism.